Thank you, Chairman Perry and members of the House Committee on Homeland Security's Subcommittee on Oversight and Management for holding this important hearing on identifying the enemy in radical Islamist terror. I ask that my written testimony be entered into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
As the President and founder of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy based in Phoenix, I'm here because I could not feel more strongly that our current direction and our current strategy or lack of strategy is deeply flawed and profoundly dangerous for the security of our nation. As a devout Muslim who loves my faith and loves my nation, the concerted focus to de-emphasize the root causes of radical Islam or political Islamic supremacism, Sharia supremacism, is the root cause of the global war that we're in. And until we name this, and then once we can name it, treat it, and counter it, we're going to continue this whack-a-mole program, which is failing day after day after day. And the denial of truth is wedded to dishonesty from those who reject the need for reform within the House of Islam and the need to engage reformers. You'll hear endless excuses as to why we should not use theopolitical terms which our enemies use to define themselves. You'll hear the absurd, and I'm sorry to say, un-American pleas for you to invoke blasphemy speech restrictions upon yourselves in the discourse in order to dishonestly avoid terms like Islamism, Islamist, Ummah, Takfir, Islamic State, Jihad, Salafism, Wahhabism, all these which are the way the enemy defines themselves, but also words that are necessary in order to know which pool these militants come from. The reason our Homeland Security is failing is because the pool that they're swimming in, they can't look at. The Omar Mateen's of the world, the Dahir Adan from Minneapolis, the Ahmed Rahani. The ideas of political Islam, anti-Westernism, anti-Semitism are things that we should be monitoring, not taking away the rights of those communities, but at least monitoring and profiling those ideas so that we know what the precursors are, because we know what those precursors are. It is a suspension of disbelief and a cognitive dissonance for Homeland Security to list for you Muslim partners and then say Islam, well, has no problem. There's a suspension of disbelief when we say we engage Muslim groups, but yet Islamism isn't related. Which is it? Either you don't engage Muslim groups because Islam has nothing to do with it, or Islamism has an issue within it, which is the problem ideology, so we need to engage Muslim groups. You can't have it both ways. You'll hear terms like securitization, where somehow if the American public engages in a debate against theocracy, which is what our founding fathers did, that'll make us into this bigoted, anti-Muslim community. Well, we fought this battle before. We can engage with the right side of those who share our values within the Muslim community in order to make it clear what are those who do not share our values inside the Muslim community, that they should not be our allies. But once you say that anyone who is Muslim and is anti-terror is on our side, then you end up doing the bidding of theocracies like Iran and Saudi Arabia and Qatar and Egypt and other military dictatorships that are Sharia states that brew these radical ideas, that love to hear us just use countering violent extremism because it allows them to continue to push the Sharia state ideology that is the drug that creates the ISISes of the world. So when you hear that in America, this attempt to invoke blasphemy laws, it's actually doing the bidding of the elephant in the room, which is the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the theocracies that love to see us not identify this as Islamism, because the grassroots movement, the hope and the prayer of the Arab awakening was about defeating dictatorships that were going to marginalize radicals, that were going to marginalize theocrats. But instead, we end up working with the arsonists as the firefighters. And that's what happens when you work with the Saudis and the Muslim groups that Secretary Johnson went and spoke to, ISNA and other groups that we are catering to, are also both the arsonists and the firefighters, because they are distributing literature that glorifies political Islam, that glorifies Sharia state ideology, and that ultimately ends up causing the harms that radicalize our community. We are ignoring movements like the Muslim Reform Movement, and I'd ask every one of you, left to right, if you truly believe in diversity, what is diversity in the Muslim community? It is not ethnic diversity or racial diversity. It is ideological diversity. And when you say that, well, we speak to the platform of the Islamic Society of North America, that is a monolithic, single ideology group that's based in an idea that is about clerics, men in beards that run the society and speak for Muslims across the country, and that is not Muslim identification. Those are not groups that represent the majority of Muslims. Even Pew data has shown that they only represent 10 to 12%. The rest of us secularized Muslims that believe in the personal aspect of our faith are not represented in major movements in America, and our Muslim reform movement has been trying to engage government, media, academia to say that we want to reform against political Islam and we need representation. That's who should be the partners. And the reason this whack-a-mole program continues is because we've not been engaging in true reform for the separation of mosque and state, and instead we've been catering to the intoxicant of political Islam, which is the precursor ideology. So in closing, I want to leave you with recommendations. I think we need to transition immediately in Homeland Security away from countering violent extremism, which you're going to hear is already supposedly bigoted, when in fact I don't even know what that is. We need to transition to countering violent Islamism, because that's what they call themselves, and that's what Arabs and Muslims across the Middle East are fighting. So it should be CVI. Second, the U.S. government and academia and media need to include a broad spectrum of diverse voices. If you believe in diversity, have Muslims debate this publicly so that we aren't just sort of marginalized to the lowest hanging fruit, which is the OIC lobby in Washington, which ends up speaking for all of our groups. It's time to stop engaging Muslim Brotherhood legacy groups and recognize their misogynist, anti-Semitic, homophobic, anti-American underpinnings. We must recognize they are not the only voice for American Muslims, and we must make women's issues and freedom of conscience and speech a litmus test when we work with these organizations. It's time to stop giving credence to the concerns of OIC dictatorships and instead have a long vision for the narratives that we're working with. And as uncomfortable as it may be to speak the language of the enemy, they do call themselves Islamists and effectively separate themselves from other Muslims. And I also ask that you reopen investigation into the Council on American Islamic Relations, Radical Ties, and their extensive domestic and foreign network, because they represent sort of an example of why these other groups were called unindicted co-conspirators and why that is so important. And I ask that you no longer fear offending by using these terms. Those first oppressed by political Islam are Muslims, moderate Muslims that are reformers. And without including us, Homeland Security depends upon your honesty in order for the American people to hold the rest of us accountable. Thank you.